Hi, Haley.
Hello, Brian.
Hi, Jason.
Hello.
Our really special guest today is Jason Parsley, who is the owner and publisher, and I think still editor of Out South Florida. He is a graduate of South Atlanta University. Is that right?
Florida Atlantic University.
Florida, sorry. I practiced it. But he was the editor of the college newspaper, and he's now part of an organization from which he just received a prize. It's a national group, I think, that Jason is credited with helping college editors or writers to really stick with it and pursue degrees in journalism and interest in writing papers. And so he knows a lot about it, and I'm excited to have his input today. And for Haley, for you to get a chance. Haley, I think you know, I write a column for Out South Florida. Um, Jason, you'll be pleased that I finished one this morning because mine is not consistent. So, Jason, my question for you is that at this time in censorship, where the Trump administration seems to have influence over every aspect of life, and 60 Minutes is refusing to go along with their owners' directives, and are actually airing challenging segments every week. What is your take on the ability of a president to silence uh, the news, and how do you avoid it?
That's a big question. We're living in unprecedented times, I think, in America. So we've never had a president that engages and so willing to engage in retaliation, and someone that is so focused on grudges and whatnot and going after his perceived enemies. So when the full force of the federal government comes after you, there's not a lot you can do. I mean,
So,
you kind of
so
have to hope for the best at that point. You can of course rely on courts, but if they put their thumb on the scale, it's you're in a very challenging situation.
how would they pressure you? Your Social Security, your income tax, how would they pressure you into getting into line without South Florida, believing at some point that it's a threat? Or
They simply file a few frivolous lawsuits.
I
You,
see.
they've got millions and millions to back it up. We don't. We're a small business. So
Yeah.
you could effectively shut down any business that way with enough money and enough lawyers.
Haley?
This is exactly where I wanted to start. Sort of the journalism and really like my first question, I have several. My first question to you, being a journalist, what would you say is the difference between journalism and activism? Or would you say that they're the same thing?
Well, I think the publication I run is more of a advocacy journalism. So it sort of mixes the two. We're still committed to truth and accuracy and all
Mm-hmm.
that. We're a gay newspaper. We do have an agenda, and I've, so when it comes to, journalism itself, you're supposed to be impartial. You're supposed to be unbiased. You're supposed to, have, listen to both sides and be neutral arbiters of the truth.
Right. And my next question to you, Brian did mention that you are very much helping people to see the joy of journalism even in today's environment. How do you and what is your approach and how do you feel about surviving, not just surviving, but really trying to thrive in journalism and advocacy in this era?
Well, I mean, this is a great time to be a reporter. I mean, it's just every day there's a slew of stories and angles to cover and whatnot. So if you like journalism, like this is the best time to be a journalist. It's the worst time to maybe own the newspaper, but it's the best time to write stories.
Do you have fun with your stories, even given sort of the pressures that come with sort of the after effects, like publishing and the responses afterwards?
I mean, in many ways, when you asked earlier about how do we avoid the wrath of the government, we're also a very small potato, and so it would take a lot for us to get the attention of the Trump administration. That's not what we're covering, right? We're covering mostly local news. If we do something national, it's an aggregate, so it's more just saying, "Hey, this happened." We're not, writing exposés about the Trump administration. Um, Now, if we write something that, let's say DeSantis did not like, that may be a different story. But we've had plenty of covers that have been very critical and of DeSantis, and we've never gotten on the radar of anyone in that way. Um, but other ways that, for instance, that we are being affected, for instance, is that now that they're shutting down like a lot of the funding and they're
Mm.
slashing budgets, you know, we used to get advertisements from the Department of Health, and that the federal money flows through the state, and then the state flows through the local health departments, and then they will take out advertisements, and that money is being, basically cut off from us.
How much money are we talking about, Jason?
That's not my side of the that's
Oh, that's not your side of it?
I just know
Yeah.
they cut us off. I don't know
Uh,
how much. I didn't ask how much. I was afraid to ask.
Jason, the paper, from my perspective, has a left bent, which is why I love it. Uh, to what degree do you believe gay Republicans read South Florida?
Probably not a lot. We did a in-house survey of our readers recently, and Trump's approval rating with our readers was at 8%.
Okay.
So it's doubtful many of them read us. But I do have the former log cabin Republican president in Broward County. He'll text me every once in a while, so I do communicate with him here and there.
Uh-huh. And how would you describe your demographic? I mean, I sort of have an idea of who reads my column in out South Florida, but what do you see as your demographic? Are they young, old, middle? Um, and most of them read the paper or do they read it online?
I mean, it skews older and male, and we definitely have more online audience.
How
When we,
large
when
is your online audience?
I think it was like a million views last month or something.
Yeah, was it? And do you have any idea how many people pick up the paper?
Well, we do have distribution numbers and stuff, but we print like 10,000 every week. So
Yeah. Well, when you had the cover of my book on it, I grabbed 4 copies.
exactly.
Jason, I wanted to ask you, how did you get here? How did you get into journalism?
When I first went to college right after high school, and I failed my first semester, all the classes, and I just didn't want to do college. So I decided to become a hairstylist. And I did that for 4 or 5 years. And then my partner really pushed me to go back to college because he felt like um, I could do um, something that would more stimulate my mind more. And I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I said, okay, let me go back, let me start it. And I just felt like journalism was such a good fit for me because I love to write and I love to ask questions. I'm a very curious person. So those are those qualities make make a good journalist. Like you have to be very curious about the world around you to be a great journalist.
So it sounds like you're creative, you're sort of a mix between the left brain and the right brain. Does that make sense?
Not when it comes to math. Terrible at math.
That's just out there for most of us. I think it's beyond human consumption. But like, I think Brian and I have spoken about this too. Sort of one of the interesting and I think fun things about people is being able to see how they cross these sort of stereotypical boundaries of like, all right, if you're sort of a guy, then you're totally going to be right-brained. If you're a woman, you're going to be left-brained, and sort of being able to look at sort of people individually and be like, all right, you're in journalism, but you started in hair design, which is far more sort of creative. Journalism is creative, but I think when you're looking at the truth and sort of the advocacy, that's more of the sort of logical side of brain. Do you consider yourself like an equal balance in between the both?
I never really thought about that, but I would say that a lot of people, a lot of writers, they kind of sometimes they'll scoff at journalism because it's not creative. But for me, actually, I look at it completely different. I look at journalism as the most creative because when you have an entire sandbox to play in and you have no boundaries, of course, it's easy to be creative under those circumstances.
Right.
But when you're giving a list of facts and a list of this, and you have to make that creative, that to me is the ultimate creativity. I remember in college, one of my first stories I wrote, I let my then partner, now husband, read it. And, I was, just waiting, for him to give me feedback. And I was so excited. And he just kind of looks at me and says, well, it's kind of boring.
Huh.
And then he immediately followed up, said, but the topic's boring. It's not your fault. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. It is my fault. It's my job to make you want to read my story. It's my job to make it interesting enough for you to pick it up, no matter what the topic is. So that's where I think journalism is actually the epitome of creativity.
Has he changed now in his estimation of your writing skills or your the creativity with boring topics?
Yeah, he's never said that again, but I never asked him either. So.
Yeah. But what's funny, Jason, is that everything that I've written since Ray and I met, he's had first look at it. And, he's always been, I mean, he catches things, which is great, but he's, always been my number one fan, which is nice to have, somebody behind you saying that's really good. And I respect his opinion, very much. So if he says he thinks it's good, I relax. I say, okay, I feel comfortable sending this in. So I understand how nice it is to have support at home. What about your folks? Are your folks living and did they like you getting into journalism from being a hairstylist?
Yes, they're both living. They live in Kentucky. And they didn't really, I mean, my mom was proud of me going back to college and whatnot. She never went to college. My father never went to college. So me and my brother both went to college.
Did you grow up in Kentucky?
Yeah, till I was 13.
I thought, I kept looking for background information on you, and it felt like Florida, and so I just assumed you were a Florida guy, but you grew up in Kentucky. Huh.
So
go ahead, Haley.
I was going to sort of steer back to sort of the journalism and where we are in this day and age, and sort of not just from a political perspective, but Michael Singer has written a wonderful book called The Surrender Experiment. And it's basically how he decided at a very early age to just sort of go with the flow and just surrender and just to say yes to things and sort of a big part of that book is, you know, him being dragged into court and being accused of certain things, and his decision at that point in time to just, you know, let it go, let it play out, and have faith that the right thing will happen. In this day and age, and especially sort of being a journalist and being sort of at that front line of receiving all of this information, because you have to decipher it, decide what you're going to write about. Do you think that it's easy or a pipe dream to kind of surrender into everything's going to work out just great?
I mean, you have to, I mean, I definitely have that attitude in a lot of ways, but I'm also very privileged. And so I know that if, one thing doesn't work out, I will have the opportunity I'll have plenty of opportunities.
And on
Uh,
a grander scale, you know, with everything that you've seen, and you've been a journalist for a while now, do you have fear that this is all just going to end up in the toilet and we're all sort of a doomed civilization?
I mean, with the current administration, I think it could definitely end up there, you know, and we just kind of have to have that hope and faith that things get better, that our institutions will last and will stand strong. But if they don't, then we have to pivot to another um,
Means of survival and means of activism, right?
yes, I think that we have to get a lot louder and a lot more in your face. And but I have hope. I have hope that it won't come to that.
How do we get louder?
Well, I think we look at what people have done in the past. I think that even when Trump first took over in 2016, 2017, there was the Women's March, right? There's been nothing comparable. I mean, yes,
Mm-hmm.
we've had these weekly rallies around the country, but there's been nothing comparable to that sort of energy and activism that we saw the first term. So there's a lot of room to continue to grow. I mean, if you look at the early years of HIV and AIDS activism, you know, particularly ACT UP in New York City, they were very aggressive. They were very in your face. They were beating the drums in a way that we just don't, in a way that I don't see any groups today doing.
Why do you think that is? Do you think that's a level of exhaustion at this point, sort of having, you know, being beaten down since sort of like 2020 with COVID, and then like probably like Trump's first and then COVID, and now we have like this going on again? Do you think it's a level of exhaustion, or do you think it's a shift in generational ideals and mindsets?
No, I definitely think it's exhaustion. Again, they took a lot of energy to fight those 4 years, and then to have that win in 2020, and then only to lose it again 4 years later. So that's one. Yes, the it's definitely exhaustion, but the other issue is Trump did win a majority he won the popular vote. So I think that
Well, actually, he did not get 50%, as you know,
yes,
of
he
the
won,
popular vote.
but he got the
He
most
got more than.
It
yeah,
was not, but it was not a mandate.
no,
You know,
I agree that there is no mandate, and
um,
that's our saving grace is that Republicans often will overreach. They often
uh-huh.
do that, and that's good for us because when they do that, there's a huge backlash and pushback.
Vacuum.
They're already overreaching, so he doesn't have a mandate. But by him getting the most votes, and especially in those early days right after the election, it looked like a much bigger win for him.
Yeah. You know,
Because it takes a while to get the votes counted. So the narrative was in those early days, and remember, most voters aren't engaged.
Mm-hmm.
That night that Trump won, they turned off their TVs and they forgot about it, right? So all they know is this huge win for him. And so that plays into that idea of like, why are we fighting? Like we spent 8 years fighting and he got the most votes. After everything that's happened, he still got the most votes.
Why do you think that is? Like, and like, to be clear, he got the most votes, I think is the easiest way to sort of characterize how this election went, because, it was, the way that I look at it is sort of a third for Trump, a third for the Democrats, and a third of people that are just so disenfranchised they either didn't vote or they voted for Green. But that still means that out of the population of the US, there are an enormous amount of people that are agreeing with his words and his ideas. And, how do you get loud in a way that those people can take a step back and not sort of be defensive? Because that's obviously the natural reaction when people are met with loud, they become defensive. So how do, sort of, as a journalist, and regardless of how big or small your reach is, how do you kind of try and edge into those so that you can be loud but in a quiet, gentle way, if that makes sense?
I think for us, what we do, and we want to make sure that people know the consequences of this administration's actions. So it's really not, it's just reiterating, like you said, like how many of our readers didn't vote, right? I don't think, they've done the analysis, and it looks like, Democrats got the most ever votes, percentage wise, with the LGBTQ population, but how many just didn't vote? How many stayed home? How many didn't donate? How many didn't volunteer? How many didn't knock on doors, right? So how many just were just exhausted? And even if they voted, that's the bare minimum we as voters have, that's a bare minimum. And like you said, many of us in this country can't even do the bare minimum. So, during Trump's first term, he wasn't nearly as bad as Democrats expected him to be, made him out to be. And there's logical reasons for that. He surrounded himself with mostly mainstream conservatives and Republicans who kept him in line, who tempered down his worst impulses. And even though he certainly did things out of the norm, for sure, ultimately, at the end of the day, it was mainstream. His big claim to fame was a tax cut package, right? That's so traditional conservative. And so this time around, I think there's a lot of people in this country who voted for Trump who expected that Trump from the first term. And what they're getting, they did not vote for this Trump. And I think they realize that now. And I think some of them absolutely regret their votes. They didn't expect a trade war in the first 2 days, tanking Wall Street. They didn't expect, they expected some border enforcement, but not like stripping away birthright citizenship and some of these outlandish and outrageous proposals.
If I can back up just a little bit. When you were talking about resistance, and Haley, you asked if it's fatigue. This is generational, Jason. ACT UP was really important during the Reagan administration. And before Reagan, we had the Anita Bryant battle. So I think some of the veterans who fought those fights and succeeded in many ways in achieving, that's why everyone's flabbergasted. We achieved so much. I think we do need an ACT UP because there are so many of us who aren't ACT UP style. I mean, it's just not who we are, but we're waiting for the opening. Because ACT UP created openings for people like me to get invited into corporations to speak. If I had been a member of ACT UP, I wouldn't be invited in to speak. But I think part of it is younger people are more isolated from one another than we were as kids. I mean, we had Woodstock and we had, all these gatherings that it was more community than holding an iPhone on your walk down the sidewalk and across the street. What do you say to that? I think it's generational.
Well, I read a great story recently about the detrimental effects of social media on our society. And one of the things they said is that the people that get most of the attention on social media are the fringe of both sides. And it's like, the people that identify on the fringe left and the fringe right. So those are the loudest voices. And what that has created is this big middle ground of people that they call the exhausted majority.
Mm.
Like I stopped posting anything controversial um on my social media feeds a long time ago because there would always be one or two trolls who would latch onto it, and it would create a thread of hundreds and hundreds of comments back and forth, and it was overwhelming. And so I just stopped it. I realized that at some point I realized that this is not productive. I'm not changing anyone's minds. I need to not do this anymore. And I think
Hmm.
that's how a lot of people have happened. But back to HIV and ACT UP, I think the reason ACT UP was so powerful, I believe, is that the entire LGBTQ community found a singular issue
Mm.
that they could rally behind. Right now, we don't have that. For many years, we had um, marriage equality we rallied behind. Everyone in our community, except maybe a fringe nut job here or there, was for LGBTQ marriage, right? No one was for more HIV. That's why it was such a rallying thing that rallied people together. We don't have that singular issue anymore, rallying the queer community together. And a lot of the younger queer community, they are focused on. I don't know if I don't know if they're really focused on issues that are going to rally the broader LGBTQ community.
Yeah, we do have an issue, but there's not m much interest in it. The whole trans issue, where they're hitting us right and left, talking about, and that's exactly what Trump said to do before the election. His advice to every Republican was bring up transgender kids getting changed before they go home, from school. But there aren't a lot of gay men who understand what the trans even means. And some are really resentful that it's holding back, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act in Congress. At least Barney Frank felt that. Uh, the trans community isn't well organized. They don't have a single spokesperson, I think, that is rallying the troops. But we do have that issue if people decided to focus on it.
Well, a couple things. I would say that, this fear mongering around trans issues, obviously it didn't work in 2022 during the midterm elections. Some Democrats have said that, oh my God, that's why we lost the 2024 election. I would push back and say, I don't believe that is the case because they used that same playbook in 2022 and we did very well in the midterm elections.
Hmm.
They used that playbook against the Democratic challenger in Omaha, Nebraska just this week, and he won
Hmm.
against a three-term Republican incumbent. So the trans issue did not resonate. So I think the trans issue is it's a fringe issue for both, for yes, the LGBTQ community, like you mentioned, but also for the mainstream community too. I think that people have strong opinions, but it's not the overriding issue. It's not like I think marriage equality, which was much more bigger for the opponents of that. I think Republicans want that to be the issue of the culture war. They want to fight that culture war desperately. Um, and speaking to your other point about gay men not understanding trans issues, we just launched a new trans series in the newspaper based exactly on your words and what you just said. And so we're trying to do our part to educate the community about trans issues. But I don't think no amount of education is ever going to be the singular issue like HIV was or marriage equality that's going to rally the entire community together. I don't, you know,
Yeah.
And that's because a lot of parents have gay kids or gay nephews and nieces, and far fewer have trans children or nieces and nephews, so they're not personally impacted by it.
I mean, other issues like, gay, LGBT people in the military. That was another issue that was broadly, um, popular, in the LGBTQ community. So again, in the older days, I think there was a lot more issues that we could all rally around, and the trans issue is divisive even inside our own community. I've had
Uh-huh.
so many discussions, and it's because especially trans healthcare, or these issues are nuanced and complex. And so to try to sum them up in a buzzword or a soundbite
Hmm.
doesn't work as well as like, love is good, or love is equal, or, discrimination is bad.
I have 2 points. I think the first one, like sort of what I see in my work and my interaction with people, is that the trans thing is sort of newer. It is very much something that is 2020 sort of thing that's come up. And the kids that are in school right now, whether they're in elementary, middle, senior school, they don't hold the same stereotypes, the same prejudices to trans people like we do. And
And that's a problem
I think that's
for conservatives, because they see that representation, they see that visibility, and that's what scares them the most,
and I
because they see the attitudes changing. They don't like that. They want people to hate trans people and the broader LGBTQ community.
yeah, and I think, when you're talking about sort of at the very individual family level, these kids go home, sort of, straight kids that are going to school with trans kids. They go home and they tell their parents about, oh, so and so's trans. And it's not a shocking conversation. It's just sort of like, all right, great, pass the gravy. And I think it's very difficult for parents who have the power to be activists, or sort of older people that have the power of activism, to think that there's a problem when they're getting that viewpoint from their kids that this is just normal. What's the big deal?
Hmm.
So I think we kind of, on sort of that issue, we kind of have to wait for that generation to kind of get into the workforce and be hit with those sort of rules and sort of injustices for them to be like, why? And then I think we will see change.
Well,
Hmm.
even the polling though does show that a majority of Americans, don't quote me on these, but generally speaking, they do not support discrimination against trans people.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I
It's
don't think it's a.
it's when you get into the more specific issues of like trans women in sports, that's when you see the polling flip.
And
When it
there's a
gets,
winner and a loser.
yes, and their side frames it as a matter of fairness, right? That's a very liberal talking point, is fairness. So
Mm.
that word fairness resonates with a lot of people. So when they say it's unfair, our side, many on our side take a step back and say, maybe they have a point.
Which I think is fine. Like, let's all do take a step back and make sure that we're speaking from a place of truth. But I
But
think,
but but, but I think the Republican governor of Utah, actually, when they tried to ban trans women from sports in his state, he wrote this very eloquent letter saying that, for him, there's only a handful of trans athletes in his state. And why are we creating
I saw that letter. Yeah.
exclusion and these laws targeting so few people? Why? And so that's such a, to me, it's really resonated, because I feel like he understands the issue better than a lot of people, or some of people on our side, because he framed it in such a better way than a lot of people frame it. Because I think sometimes we don't know how to talk about it. So we ignore it, or just say, or we just declare unilaterally, yes, trans women should play in sports.
The other point that I wanted to make, and sort of looking at sort of the difference in where we are today and seeing if it's generation or exhaustion thing. When I look back historically at sort of the changes that came out of sort of your generation, Brian, and sort of the generation after that, I feel like that generation had a very personal experience on a very widespread level. Almost every family was impacted in some way by what was happening during that time. You know, so many people were impacted by World War II. So many people were impacted by Vietnam. And sort of we had these big things sort of just going one into the next, into the like rolling into one into the next. So many people, you know, even in that day and age when social media wasn't as it is now, knew somebody that had been arrested or had received violence for protesting. You know, they were using in those days really violent ways of dealing with US protesters that today we say are unacceptable. So I feel like back then people had very real personal experiences of knowing somebody that was either impacted in some way by these big scale events. I don't think we have that today. I think it's so secular. And I think that's what sort of pulls us out of that unification is that not everybody has that very personal involvement with some of these issues.
I
Well,
think,
I mean, if you look at like the Black Lives Matter protest in 2020, that became a rallying cry, and that
Mhm.
definitely united a lot of different disparate factions of people in the United States and brought them together, you know, and because it was clearly, you know, not right what happened, right? It was just there's no other way to look at it. Like even people on the right had a hard time defending what happened, you know, and most of them did not.
And
yeah,
they've
if
taken down all of those memorials.
I think this was true with the segregation issue. One, there was limited media. People watched NBC, CBS, you know, there was only like three stations on television, and there were no social media. There was none except maybe radio. And so people saw what was being done live. People saw what was being done, and there was an impact on them personally. Uh, with all the social media, and I'm eager to hear your opinion, uh, Jason, on what's next. With there is no place to go for accurate information that is nonpartisan, right? So, so the truth that we're trying to get out is far more difficult to get out. It's harder to hook people emotionally than it was before when Walter Cronkite would say, you know, about the Vietnam War, it needs to end. And it then did.
Well, I
But
mean, when the Trump administration's going after trying to defund, you know, NPR and PBS, and I mean, obviously, we know how bland, you know, PBS is, and you know, so benign, and NPR too. If you listen to their stories, it's just very straight-laced.
mhm.
There's not a lot of flavor to them, and so they're very middle of the road, and yet even that isn't good enough. And so that's why, you know, he is, you know, he's waging a war against, you know, the freedom of the press. He's waging a war on the First Amendment, and we are lucky in one regard that this isn't his first term.
And last.
Yeah, because you know if he had started his first term out like this and he had two terms, 8 years
Boy.
to we'd be in a much worse position after 8 years. But
And it,
I think that when the midterms come around, if you know history proves true, you know the country will turn against the ruling party, which is the Republicans, and there'll be a huge turnover.
can I go back for a second, just in terms of talking about why people are not engaged, and from our community on the LGBTQ QIAA 2S community. We overwhelmed them without educating them. Every time somebody came along, I mean, it kept getting added and added. I'm non-binary. And older people say, what the does that mean? But they don't take the time to find out, right? Because then there's something next coming. I'm gender queer. I'm gender fluid. I'm two-spirit. I'm what? I mean, the Canadians take two-spirit very seriously, but we keep adding initials to our train, right? From LGBT. I mean, it's just gone crazy. And so, my job was to try to explain all of that to straight audiences, what these words mean, why they're important. But I think a lot of the population just gave up trying to understand it. They don't understand the difference between non-binary and transgender. What would you say to that?
Well, I think we are in this era of unprecedented individualism.
Hmm.
It's community, it's no longer, about larger communities. It's about social media has allowed us to explore these niches, right? Like, and to get very molecular and like very granular. Like, I belong to this specific community, and in some ways that's great. Like, you find other people you can relate to and that understand you better than anyone else. But
Hmm.
then you also lose something if you focus too much on that individualism, if you give up too much of the community. Like the old saying, it takes a village, right?
Right.
So we do need to focus on the village as well. And um I think social media is just it's really um detrimental to society, probably more corrosive to society than anything else that we've encountered. And that's going to be a challenge for us. As a society, how do we overcome it?
I'm going to
How
throw
do you
the whole thing into that. The AI.
What?
what's that? Oh, yeah,
Yeah. I,
that's right. Artificial intelligence. How is that going to impact journalism, Jason? And if social media is the problem, how do you move past it? I mean, because people all are on
Well,
influencers are the big
well,
thing. Who's an influencer?
I mean, there are ways to move past it. One, we have to revisit Section 230, I think it's called. And we have to allow people to hold these large companies accountable. As a small newspaper, I can be sued. It's more likely I can be sued and lose for a defamation or a libel suit or whatever than Facebook could be, because they're protected, because they say we're not a content creator, therefore we're protected. If
No.
but yet, take YouTube for instance, they're making boatloads and millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars off of these content creators. Yet they're not responsible for what those content creators produce or say. So it's in their best interest to make sure that these content producers produce the most outlandish, outrageous, ridiculous stuff to get
Yeah.
people to watch it. So Section 230 must be revisited, and we have to put checks and balances in place to hold these large big tech accountable. That's number one. Number two, we have to address the algorithms. The algorithms that these Facebook and others have placed upon us reinforce the bubble that we live in. And that I think is the most detrimental thing, is that the reinforcement. You
Mhm.
know, in this story that I read that talked about the exhausted majority, for instance, it addressed the amplification of misinformation and disinformation. You put something out there on social media, someone shares it, and then remember how the old saying was, a lie makes it way around, halfway around the world before the truth comes out or something. So
Uh-huh.
that is even more true today when you have tens of millions of people sharing the same content, and their solution was shutting down that feature on social media. Is that if I want to share your story, I have to manually copy and paste it and share it myself. I don't know if that will correct all the issues, but at least that was an idea. We need ideas on how to rein
Mhm.
in social media, because it's sort of like what they're concerned about is profit.
I
So
think
when
that's a
they're
whole nother
only
conversation on the whole capitalism and
yes, when their only
social.
concern is profit and not the public good, we're going to run into big issues with them. And when there's no way to hold them accountable, again, if a regular corporation produces a product that kills people, they will be sued, right? And the justice system will work its way. But when these social media companies are immune to that, they can do whatever the hell they want and not give a shit.
But I think we're seeing that being played out in so many different arenas. It's not just in social media, it is in that sort of capitalistic where everything now has been made into something profitable. Where, it's playing out very obviously in the government, it's playing out very obviously in big pharma, it's playing out very obviously in social media, in, food, in all these areas where we are getting these wonderful spotlights right now. So I think it's a,
But how many other of those industries are immune and cannot be sued?
I mean, big pharma can't be sued.
What?
Big pharma doesn't have any kind of, at this moment in time, have any kind of constraints. They can get sued, but they don't actually pay the fines.
Well, they can be sued for faulty or for bad drugs and stuff. I mean, they can definitely, there's been many like, big pharma lawsuits, but, they don't have, I don't think there's a law that, gives them immunity.
No, there isn't. Jason, you said 230 before, and I don't know what that is. What is that?
I might be wrong on that. I think it's section, let me Google it.
It doesn't matter. Is it from a book or is it from,
No, it's a,
It's
is
section
it?
230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996.
Oh, okay.
So basically, when that law was put into place, it was to allow the internet to grow unrestrained. And we didn't want at that time all of these lawsuits shutting down parts of the internet, because of, speech and other things, right? So it was good. It was a good thing. It was a good law, but that law has now been exploited. And most laws, they may have a good intent when they're implemented, but they should probably a lot of laws in this country should be revisited from time to time and say, hey, does this need updated? Is it out of date now?
does that apply to the Constitution?
Yes, and that's why we have 27 amendments, right? Like we even right after the Constitution was put into place, the Bill of Rights came about pretty quickly because the founders immediately realized they recognized some deficiencies in it.
So, conscious of time, Jason, I wanted to ask you, sort of looking forward now, you have the power of the pen, the power of the word. What is your passion, and what would you say is sort of what is the legacy that you're building for yourself in terms of journalism, in terms of the way that you are showing up?
Ooh, I don't want to think about legacy yet. Am I there yet?
I think
Yeah, well, you're in the process of creating it. Jason, I never thought of my life as a legacy either. It wasn't until I got into my 70s that I started to look back and see, what was going on. That's what the memoir was about. But I think what I'm hearing Haley say is just, what's next for you and what's next for media to tell the truth. Is that right, Haley? Is that,
yeah, and very much personally for you.
yeah.
Journalism is your passion. You obviously have a gift. It is, part of your purpose. So where are you finding yourself sort of steered into following that passion?
I mean, my trajectory, I started at a more mainstream outlet for 3 years, and then I got hired at South Florida Gay News, which is our predecessor, and now I own my own. So I've sort of that was my so where do I go from here? I don't I sometimes I've thought about that. Like now that I own my own media company, where do I go from here? I think though it's not about going anywhere per se. It's about doing what we do best, continuing to focus on truth and accuracy, and informing our readers and encouraging them to be engaged, and providing them with providing with all the information so they can make their own decisions and whatnot. And I think that again, there's a reason why, our industry is protected inside the First Amendment. That's how important our industry, journalism, is to the foundation of this country, to our democracy, and everyone should want to protect it. You know, there are plenty of outlets that I may not agree with or a story I may not agree with, but our fundamental rights are being threatened right now. And so it does energize me and say, no, we have to, we it makes me want to fight more.
You talked about doing what we do best. Might I suggest that you would be extraordinary as a podcaster? That you have a great mind, you have a great voice. I see you sitting exactly where you are with this background. Um, I do. And uh, I've loved getting to know you better through this podcast. Uh, and I'm mostly about your mind, not that you're from Kentucky, but about how you think, and how broadly you understand the big picture. And I think you'd attract a much younger crowd than Haley and I might. Uh, and that you'd be terrific at it. I hope you'll consider it.
Well, that's actually why I have this background. As I told my art team, I said, I'm thinking about doing a podcast. Make me a background that really stands
All right.
out.
Good. That's
So
They did a great
we
job.
got the background. I just haven't come up with the podcast yet.
It's a great background. They did a great job. I love
Thank
it.
you. Everyone loved it. It's great. He did good.
Possibly my last question for you, Jason, is what is your definition of success? And not long term, just like every day, what would you say is like, I've been successful today?
When what solidified my desire to be a journalist was when I was working at the college newspaper, and I wrote a story that had an impact. Like it had a tangible, noticeable impact. And I realized the power of my words.
hmm
And so that's what I considered success, is like my story changed something.
hmm
And sometimes those changes can be small and sometimes really, really big. But that's how I would define success, is that if we're having an impact on the world, small or big, that's success.
And if I can, Haley, we have a couple of minutes.
We do.
Uh, Jason, from my life experiences, is that what we have successes. Some we're not even aware of. People come back to me 30 years and said, your book saved my life. But we can't stop with the success, and get caught in it. We have to keep going, to do the thing that has created the success, which is to write, or speak about something that moves people into a new direction in their lives. Um, well, that's my 2 cents, is that you keep going. You don't stay still, uh, being excited about the success. You're glad, but then you move on because there's, more to say. I'm one of those people, I have to write. I have to, even if I didn't have a column to put out with you, I would write. I just need to express myself. And and so I just keep going with it, successful or not. And so, I think you're a total success, Jason, but you keep going, until you're my age. And then you're allowed to smell the roses.
I think that's the gift of every new day is that it resets the success bar.
Yep. Yep.
Great.
It does, but I would say, tying this all back in, is that, keeping going, et cetera, that's great. But I think that when I mentioned like the exhausted majority, like I would say when Trump was first reelected, like I felt that exhaustion. Like it just
Mhm.
hit me like Apollo bricks. I'm like, I just can't keep going on. I can't keep doing
Hmm.
this. Like I just can't. And then, then he took office and I'm like, okay, we have to keep doing this.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the
Me-
beauty of the world is like every time you think you just can't do it again, something happens
Yeah.
and you're just like, how is this? Like we have that, some people have it where we just have this resilience in us where we're like, no, no, done, can't do it. And
Yeah.
they were like, maybe.
Yeah. What do I do next? I
Yeah.
mean, how can I be of influence? A call to my senator, who both are Republicans, is not going to make a difference at all. But I can write, or I can speak. Uh, I can join a group that I was never known about before and sit on an advisory committee.
And sometimes you never know what it's going to be that triggers that change. Like,
Mhm.
when Pulse happened in Florida, we thought that maybe Florida would roll back some of its, gun laws and rights, and it didn't. But then Parkland happened, and it did. So Parkland was that singular movement that rallied so many different factions together that made change, a huge impact on this state, right? So just because one movement doesn't work, or just because one event doesn't change, doesn't mean the next one's not going to.
And Parkland was about children, right? And
Yes,
Pulse was about homosexuals. And
yes,
measuring the country's interest or response, of course, the children they're going to care most about.
correct. And that's why, of course, conservatives, or especially, the far right, has always leveraged children against the LGBTQ community, right? They've pitted
Yeah,
us against them. And so, but because Pulse happened first, but then Parkland happened, and I think the LGBTQ community was suddenly a part of that movement.
yeah,
Like if Pulse hadn't happened and Parkland did, would our community have cared as much?
exactly.
So
Ex-
it built up to that.
Yeah,
Wonderful, and we are out of time, but there's a wonderful saying, supposedly a Mayan saying, but it's what doesn't happen in 1,000 years can change in an instant. All it takes is for God to sign the wind, and the wind changes direction. And I think that's where we sometimes have to surrender and just let things be and wait for that sort of inspired action to be like, right now you're on the field. It's your turn.
yeah. Jason's not a big believer, not a religious guy. He'll tell
I don't
you.
think that that's necessarily religious. I think it's just, it's physics and it's like fact. Things change
Yeah.
so quickly without us. Sometimes we're so egotistical and think that we make the change. It,
Uh-huh.
sometimes it's totally out of our control.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
and then we're asked to be like, all right, how are you going to show up today?
look at like, Assad in Syria, right? For years
Mm-hmm.
there was this fight back and forth, and everyone sort of gave up hope, and like he's going to be here forever. And then overnight he was gone.
And the guy that's in charge now was like the other night we had a $10 million ransom on his head by the US, and now he's meeting Trump saying he's a great guy. So things
Well,
change.
because he's going to build a Trump Tower Damascus.
Things change, and I think we have to,
I think they can change really quick. So,
Mhm.
and I think it's just we have to show up and in our passion, having fun and being truthful.
mhm.
But thank you, Jason, for your time today.
Yeah, that was
Thank you.
great. That
You
was
and
great.
having a
Uh,
journalist to kind of
yeah,
actually interact with and to get real sort of information in terms of what that is today. Thank you.
Thank
perfect,
you.
perfect guest and and friend and editor.
Amazing.
We
Thank
should,
you
we should do
both.
we should do lunch soon, Brian.
What's that?
Lunch soon.
Yeah.
Enjoy. Lots of love to you both.
Thank you. Bye.